Okay, so today's lesson we're going to look at resistance to change and reasons for why change may be resisted by different institutions or groups. So resistance to change can have an extremely powerful effect on change being accepted and implemented. This is because when change is resisted, it's usually done by groups of people, not generally just individuals. So they generally have a decent amount of power or resources to resist that change. Conformity and commitment to change also play a major role in change being resisted, and we're going to look into that a little bit further. But the main reason for that is because, as whilst we might not agree with the resistance, so as individuals we might see a change that is coming in that we might agree with, but for most people we feel comfortable in being a part of a group, and so even though we may agree with the change, we'll still resist it anyway. So we're going to be looking at two different types of resistance to change, and they come through cultural and social. There are other two which are organisational and personal, but they're not really society and culture focused, so we're just going to be focusing on cultural and social. So the cultural barriers to change are values and beliefs, cultural ethnocentrism, and incompatibility of a cultural trait with change. So some of these terms you might already be familiar with, but we're going to go into a little bit more depth of them to look at how these factors might lead to resistance to change. So like I said, the first one that we're going to be looking at is values and beliefs as a resistance to change. And this usually means when change is seen to be in direct challenge or conflict with existing values or beliefs in a society or a culture, and therefore the change is resisted. So it seems pretty, that one seems pretty self-evident in terms of how that would lead to resistance of change. This is generally quite a powerful one as well, and it can be done on an individual level, on a group level, or even on a macro societal level. A good example is the proposed changes to marriage laws. If you hear, I didn't spell proposed changes to the marriage laws. If you listen to any discussions made by Christian lobby groups, or even just conservative groups, they're usually discussing how the idea of marriage is generally done between a man and a woman, and this is stemming from their religious beliefs and some of their values as well. So their resistance is coming from the idea that the change is challenging those values or beliefs and therefore needs to be resisted. So cultural ethnocentrism we should be familiar with. I'll just remind you what that is. It's when we believe that one culture is deemed inferior to another. So essentially we believe that culture, or like if we were to say Australia, if you were to be ethnocentric in Australia, you would believe that Australian culture is better than any other culture that exists out in society. So cultural ethnocentrism as a resistance to change usually occurs when the cultural group trying to bring about the change is deemed inferior. So there could be lots of examples of this around the world. Any minority group within a Western country that tries to bring about change and that change being resisted could be kind of categorised under cultural ethnocentrism. A good example, or a good current example in Australia today, is the proposed changes to Australia Day by Indigenous groups. And if you hear, lots of discussions that are occurring around that it's always about kind of how, Australia Day is what it is and it's always been that way, so therefore why does it need to change? So there's no real kind of recognition that, at least from those that are resisting the change, there's no real recognition that the opinions and the values of the Indigenous groups that are trying to bring about change and the other people that are supporting it are valid, and it's usually coming under that kind of idea that their beliefs and values and their perspectives and opinions are not as valuable as the more dominant culture. So the last one we're going to look at in terms of cultural barriers to change, or cultural reasons for resistance to change, is the incompatibility of a cultural trait with change. So this is just when change is, can't seem to spell today. This is when change is seen to go completely against the established cultural norms. So this could be very similar to values and beliefs as a form of cultural resistance. Values and beliefs will definitely come under this. So you will notice that there are some similarities here. So again, this one can be quite powerful, especially because this is more done on a societal level. So there's lots of groups of people that could be resisting this change. And resistance to change is always stronger when there's groups of people resisting it, not just individuals. And this can occur even when the change is seen to benefit a group, but their perspective of that change is seen to be so incompatible with that group itself that even though it might be beneficial, they'll still resist it anyway. So this kind of resistance to change is always visible, because it's visible as resistance because the discussions about it are always centered around tradition, cultural beliefs and things like that. So the proposed changes to marriage laws could also be seen as incompatibility of a change with a cultural trait. It's always visible because whenever you hear groups discussing why they're resisting that change, they're always discussing it in terms of, it's been tradition that marriage is between a man and a woman. Our religious beliefs around marriage is that it's between a man and a woman. So incompatibility of a cultural trait with change is very visible. Just focus on the discussion. Okay, so the last thing we're going to look at today is social barriers to change, or the social barriers that lead to resistance to change. So like I said, for this one there's only going to be two, so fear of loss of power and conformity to norms. So the first one is fear of loss of power, and this is when groups in power see the change as undermining or challenging their status, their social status, or their power. This is actually quite a powerful form of resistance to change, as the groups in power usually have a lot of resources in order to resist that change. So usually their resistance can kind of outweigh that change and make sure it doesn't happen. So current examples of this could be looking at, say, if you guys have ever heard about the discussions around fraternities, so that's the kind of the party houses you might see in popular culture that exist just off the university campuses in the US. So these fraternities tend to have a lot of power within the unis because they tend to be from people that live there tend to be from fairly wealthy families, and lots of them go on to be quite successful. In fact, most of the presidents in the United States have been members of fraternities, and what they tend to do once they become successful is provide lots of funding to universities, so they become quite a powerful alumni. So because of this, universities kind of rely on them, especially in America, because they are generally businesses as universities. So they rely on fraternities for funding. And so there's been lots of discussions around the kind of unethical practices that go on in lots of fraternity parties. And so there's been several pushes to try and close them down or limit the freedoms that the fraternities have, but it's kind of gotten nowhere. And yeah, so the fraternities' resistance to restrictions or even closures is a really good example of this. And as you might well know already, that there has been no shutting down of fraternities. They're still very much in practice in America, and that doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon. So that's one good example of where fear of loss of power can be quite a strong resistance to change. This is going to be something we come back to a lot as well for when we look at Afghanistan, because a lot of change that is resisted in Afghanistan is because of a fear of loss of power. So the other one is just the conformity to norms. So when we, as already discussed, when we're a part of a group, we feel more comfortable in going along with what that group thinks and feels, even when the change is seen to be beneficial for us. So essentially, conformity to norms as a resistance to change is for us to be a part of a group. You need to follow the expected norms, and as we've already looked at, throughout the Year 11 course, is what happens when we don't follow those norms. And essentially, if we don't follow norms, we can be excluded. So again, this can be quite a powerful form of resistance to change, because most people like I said, most people like to feel a part of a group, and so we don't want to get that exclusion. We all know exclusion can occur, so we're kind of afraid of that, and therefore, even if the change is seen to be beneficial for the most part, we can still kind of reject it or go against it. A good example of this could be and by no means is this a major resistance. There's some areas of resistance, but it seems to be changing a little bit. But the restricting of transgender students from accessing different toilets to changing their uniform could be seen as examples of this. Because, as we know, it's kind of been the norm for centuries for men to wear certain clothes and women to wear certain clothes, and to kind of break that down, and change is seen to be somewhat of going against our cultural established norms or our social established norms. So the restricting of transgender students, and that's the same for school as well, because schools have set uniforms for boys and girls, so to go against that is seen to be kind of challenging those established norms, and therefore to propose for that to change, conformity to those norms could definitely be seen as a form of resistance for that. So that's the lesson for resistance to change. Make sure you refer to the booklet for your revision notes for this lesson.